This hour on 924 News, Special Counsel Robert Mueller has indicted more than a dozen Russian nationals and organizations for meddling in the 2016 U.S. election.
And the FBI confirms it received a second tip that the suspect in the Florida shooting was plotting an attack but failed to investigate.
Plus, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says the United States and NATO ally Turkey are trying to resolve their sharp differences over Syria.
Our two countries share the same objectives in Syria.
From the I-24 News Studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
This was a big day for the special counsel investigation examining the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Federal prosecutors indicted 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian groups. The charges include conspiracy and fraud.
The indictment depicts an elaborate scheme in which some of those accused came to the United States with the deliberate intention of undermining the American political process, and more specifically, the 2016 presidential election. Correspondent Serena Marshall has more.
The Justice Department says it was a sophisticated plan to undermine the U.S. election. 13 Russian nationals and 3 Russian companies.
A little technical problem, but basically 13 individuals, 3 Russian companies. The allegation is that some of them even traveled to the United States and created fictitious personas in the United States and ginned up social media announcements and protests. They staged protests, including both for Donald Trump after he was elected, but also protesting his election. And again, this is part of the special counsel investigation who's been looking at alleged Russian meddling and whether or not there's been any collusion. The Deputy Attorney General went out of his way on this day to say that there was nobody that this didn't affect anything in the 2016 campaign, and that there was nothing that anybody did wrong on the United States end, that they were simply unwittingly in communication with some of these bots, as they're called.
Well, the exact line is that some of the defendants communicated with unwitting individuals associated with the Trump campaign, and also the indictment read specialists were instructed to post content on social media that focused on politics in the USA and to use any opportunity to criticize Hillary Clinton and others.
Yeah, following the announcement, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, took to Twitter and said, quote, "Russia started their anti-U.S. campaign in 2014 long before I announced that I would run for president. The results of the election were not impacted. The Trump campaign did nothing wrong, no collusion."
Well, to further discuss this, we have now senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv. Dan, is there any information on how much Russia's government invested in that effort to meddle in the U.S. elections?
All of this was complex, Tal, but I would say it was pretty cheap. The special prosecutor who has all these details in the 37-page indictment, the email addresses they used, what banks, their use of PayPal, how they came to the United States and posed as American political activists. Wow. It says that by the time Election Day 2016 rolled around, the budget for all this was $1.25 million per month. That's just one indication that the special prosecutor's investigators, including the FBI and apparently U.S. intelligence agencies such as the CIA, figured out what was going on in St. Petersburg, Russia. Thus, the 13 people who are indicted, their name, there are a lot of details about the work they did. They called their job information warfare. All 13 are accused of fraud against the U.S. by interfering in the American election. Then some are accused of identity theft and financial crimes. Tal and David.
Dan, is this largely a symbolic indictment, though? Because it doesn't seem like there's any chance of actually extraditing these 13 Russians or somehow actually bringing them to the United States and having a trial.
Well, the Deputy Attorney General who's in charge of this, Rod Rosenstein, he said that the normal procedures will be followed. He expects the U.S. government to ask Russia's government to arrest and extradite these people. But the understanding is that even though they posed as employees of 3 private companies in Russia, that they're backed by the Russian government, so extradition is not considered likely. But it is possible that they'll make a mistake. They'll travel, who knows, on vacation to some other country, and they will be arrested and brought to the U.S. It has happened before. I wouldn't rule it out, David and Tal.
I'm wondering if it's also some matter of deterrence and to what extent can it actually serve as deterrence. But Dan, does this indictment represent the sum total of Robert Mueller's investigation? Maybe now, you know, he's near the end of his work, or is just to be continued?
Probably not. Rosenstein made a point of saying that the investigation does continue. And we do know from reliable sources that, among others, Steve Bannon was questioned at length by Robert Mueller's team just in recent days. Also, one example of an American who helped these Russians, his name is Ricky Pinedo. That's a new name in the scandal. This Californian, also known as Richard Pinedo, has made a deal with prosecutor Mueller to plead guilty to one count of identity theft. He admits, maybe not knowing they were Russians, he sold to them bank account numbers and names. That is, of course, identity theft. One last comment, though President Trump is pointing to the Department of Justice statement that there's no evidence that the election was changed in any way, the outcome, like that's why Trump won because of the Russians. Barack Obama's CIA Director John Brennan today says it's implausible that what these clever Russian agents did had no influence on the votes of at least some Americans. David and Tal?
Dan Raviv, our senior Washington correspondent. Dan, thank you very much. Let's bring in Gary Gerstenfield, a criminal defense attorney and trial lawyer. Gary, to the point that Dan just made and the argument we just heard that, oh, some Americans must have had their views shaped by this, and yet their views were likely more shaped by the $1 billion that was spent on advertising. So why should Americans care about the Russians trolling and creating some fake media at the tune of $1 million?
Well, it's a scary bit of business. You think about the idea that, you know, our country's sense of politics now is going to be affected or impacted by the Russians. I mean, it's a scary stuff. It's the making of a great movie. And we're living it now.
But isn't it scary? Or I mean, some of the ads that the political parties actually run? I mean, the idea that the Russians might have had some huge, I mean, the Justice Department said there was no impact. Nothing impacted the 2016 campaign. There's a lot of money that's spent on trying to misinform American voters by Americans.
Well, you know, I'll tell you, when Rosenstein, when he said that this did not affect the election, it makes you wonder, why would he say that? First of all, it's not the point. The purpose of an investigation is to ferret out and then present an indictment, present information, not to reach conclusions, at least this early into the investigation. So it seems a little strange to me that at this point he's reaching a conclusion that all this stuff, all this money's being spent, we're going after these Russians, we've got indictments on 13 people, probably more indictments are coming, more people are going to be arrested, but relax, don't worry. The election was still fair and honest. That seems like a strange dichotomy between what the purpose of the investigation, the money's being spent to pursue this investigation, and then already reaching such an early conclusion.
Well, Gary, the indictment also read that some of the defendants communicated with unwitting individuals associated with the Trump campaign. What do you make of this line? How do you read this?
A collision. You know, you have people that really hate Hillary Clinton. They're on the internet. They're easy to contact or easy to reach out to. A grassroots organization, or the concept of grassroots, is that it isn't a specifically organized, like a national thing where you have, you know, identified individuals. It's just anybody. I mean, that's the thing about the internet. You don't know who necessarily you're talking to. As a matter of fact, the internet makes the whole Russian thing, this whole investigation, possible because of the anonymity, because you're able to assume an identity. And frankly, it's not necessarily illegal. If you want to create a grassroots organization and call yourself something, you can do that. If you want to create a persona of somebody that you're not and try to create that and go after Hillary Clinton using this persona, maybe because you don't want your boss to find out what you're doing, that's not necessarily illegal. And it's a ripe opportunity for something like this to happen, where the Russians have a lot of money, they come in and they spend it, and nobody's paying attention. After all, Facebook didn't say no to the money. None of these organizations said no to the money. None of the marketing companies looked to see where it was coming from. Hey, you want to spend the money? Whatever. And it was such an unusual campaign where you had, for example, Donald Trump leading cheers of lock her up, and it became a festive affair. It was perfect opportunity for Russian meddling. And whether it's illegal or not is an interesting issue, because unfortunately what Mueller is also going to run into is the problem of the First Amendment, which is that people can say some terrible things, particularly about public officials and public figures. I mean, after all, Hillary Clinton is about as a public a figure as you're going to get, And what that means is you can say terrible things about her, even if you, even if you know they're not true.
I want to circle back to your answer to Tal, because Tal was asking about the indictment and the unwitting contacts with the Trump campaign, and she asked what your take on that was. Did you say collision or did you say collusion?
Well, so far, the only thing that
I thought I heard you say collusion.
Yeah, the only thing the Mueller investigation has so far has revealed is basically a collision of people running to talk to Russia. I mean, whether it's the idea these guys organized and actually colluding. So far, we haven't really seen that. What we have seen, though, is a lot of people colliding around, and in fact, that's kind of what the Russians were relying on as far as this entire effort to try to get this information out through the internet.
Gary, it could be that as we speak now, this is still ongoing. You know, Russian forces try to intervene, looking towards the midterms even. Do you think this indictment is an actual deterrence?
Well, there's already some discussion and some concern that Russians are involved in trying to get us, sending bots out about pro-guns and maybe take the guns away. I mean, the meddling by the Russians through the internet is an ongoing process. We think it may start in 2014, but it's still ongoing, and there's no way that it can be stopped. I mean, it's through the internet.
Gary Gerstenfield, criminal defense attorney and trial lawyer. Gary, thanks so much. We appreciate it. Tal, if somebody would have said to me a year ago that the Russians might somehow try to interfere and meddle, I would have said, or 2 years ago, I would have said, of course. The United States tries to meddle.
So what?
Of course the Russians try to influence our elections. The United States has been trying to meddle and influence elections in South America and Central America and Eastern Europe
more so
for
the Middle East.
Decades. Of course, this is what countries do. And the fact of the matter is there is a lot of false information that's out there on the internet. And who cares whether it necessarily comes from Russia or somebody else? The question is, can people be responsible and make their own decisions and find the facts? I mean, to me, great that they're indicting these 13 Russian nationals. They will never bring them to trial.
Well, people outside the United States tend to look at this investigation in a different light. And it's interesting that you're saying it. It's not a voice that is commonly heard in American media. People are so fearful that, oh, no, the Russians are interfering with our politics. Well, the United States has been interfering with a lot of other politics for a long time. That's how the game is played. Still ahead, in the Middle East, thousands of protesters took to the streets in Tel Aviv and called for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to step down. Earlier this week, police recommended that Netanyahu face a criminal indictment. Meanwhile, Netanyahu is hundreds of miles away at the security conference in Munich, vowing that Israel will continue to act against Iran and Syria. New problems for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That's right. Hundreds of Israeli demonstrators gathered on this day in Tel Aviv and called for Netanyahu's resignation. Earlier this week, police recommended a criminal indictment against him for alleged bribery and corruption. Our diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim has the latest.
The people say he's got to go. At least that's what about 600 to 700 people had to say in Tel Aviv's Kikar Habima in an anti-corruption rally. Those in attendance and those speaking say that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needs to leave office with corruption allegations swirling around him. The Israeli police recommended that Netanyahu be indicted on a number of charges related to bribery, breach of trust, and fraud, and it's now all in the hands of Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit. Some of the themes of the protests out here today, led by anti-corruption crusader Eldav Yaniv, a former government lawyer insider. Mush Haktim Habaita. That's what this sign says in Hebrew. That means corrupt people go home. And we also trying to stress the anti-political nature of the rally, although that's tough to do when you're talking about left versus right. This sign in Hebrew says Lo Yamin, Lo Smola, Yishar, meaning no right, not left, just straight. And that's what the speakers tried to emphasize today. It's not a matter of left or right on the political spectrum. It's a matter of doing what's morally right. And they say that Benjamin Netanyahu no longer has the moral authority to lead Israel. These rallies are expected to continue for a number of weeks until Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit makes the final decision as to whether or not to indict the Prime Minister of Israel. Reporting from Tel Aviv, Mike Wagenheim, I-24 News.
Meanwhile, Mr. Netanyahu has shifted his public focus to security.
The Prime Minister just attended a security conference in Munich where he met with United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Netanyahu told Guterres that Israel would never give up its stake in the Golan Heights or end its campaign to keep Iran out of nearby Syria.
Last weekend, Israel and Iran had a direct military clash over northern Israel and Syria. Iran flew a drone into Israeli airspace. Israel shot it down. And then Israeli aircraft attacked Iranian command and control systems in Syria, and a surface-to-air missile brought down an Israeli F-16.
To discuss, let's bring in Thane Rosenbaum, distinguished fellow at NYU Law School. Thane, Netanyahu in Munich today said the Golan Heights will remain in the hands of Israel forever. That's the word he used. You know, in Israel, the Golan was a much disputed area, especially back in the 1990s with Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister. There was a discussion whether or not to give back the Golan to the Syrians in exchange for peace. Now it seems that the Golan is just a consensus from right to left in Israel. Do you see this debate being reopened, maybe by the international community?
Absolutely not. I mean, the peace deals between Egypt, Israel, and Jordan and Israel are still sustaining, and those are stable governments in place. There's such incredible instability and mounting, escalating tensions in Syria with, yes, the civil war is subsiding, but you have Iran and you have Russia, you have meddling there too. And so, you know, given what we just saw this weekend, I can't imagine the Israelis ever having an appetite for giving back the Golan.
There are some serious military threats in Syria and from Iran, and yet there's a famous movie in the United States called Wag the Dog. It came up during Bill Clinton's impeachment, where he launched missiles into Africa right before he was about to get impeached. Is there some of that going on here with Netanyahu?
Well, look, you know, the 1,000 people who came out to protest, it's 1,000 people, it's not that many people. You know, the Israelis are not unaware of the existential threats in their region. They see the instability. Gaza is completely deteriorating. They saw what just happened with Iran and the launching of a drone attack. When it comes down to it, I'm not sure that the Israelis care that much about the cigars and the perfume and the jewelry. I think in the end, Netanyahu is considered, like from The Godfather, a wartime consigliere. I mean, he's a wartime prime minister, like a Churchill, and I think in the end, that's what's going to prevail. Meanwhile, it's obviously in Netanyahu's interest to point out that there is this tension, and I'm your guy. And I want Syria to know, I want Iran to know, I want Russia to know, even though Israel and Russia has had really friendly relations as of late. I want everyone on notice that we will respond immediately. And I do think that what you saw last weekend was a very good example of Iran getting a little frisky and almost demonstrating what Israel's always said, their most promiscuous player in the region. With the civil war dying down, they decided to take a shot, and the Israelis retaliated.
So do you think that the Israel-Iran front on the ground in Syria was it just a beginning, or will it further escalate according to your estimations? Or
you know, the Iranians are just phenomenal chess players, and I do think that this was a move that they tried. I think there was a message being sent. I think that they wanted to test it. Remember, it's a drone. It flew into Israeli airspace. The Israelis let it fly in for a little while because they knew it was unmanned. We're not sure whether it would have launched anything. They took it out, and of course, Israel immediately retaliated against the anti-aircraft batteries in Syria. I just can't imagine, you know, Iran meddles, and they talk smack, they talk tough talk. But I can't imagine them actually initiating an actual conflict with the Israelis.
Well, UN Chief Antonio Guterres, he also spoke of Israel at that conference in Munich. He said he called the peace process with the Palestinians at a dead end. You know how much optimism was on both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians, when Trump took office. What do you make of this fraction, the stagnation in the peace process now?
I do think that that's also one of the reasons why you have such objections to Netanyahu now and this corruption case, that at least on the left and with the Israeli media, it has a lot to do with blaming him for the stalled negotiations. Yes, there's corruption, And I think it's important also to remember that Israel is the only country in that region where this could even happen to their political leader. This is an important ongoing question. Israel holds their leaders accountable. As for the Palestinian question, look, you know, Gaza is such a mess. It is really under a sense of real deterioration right now. And it's not even clear whether even Hamas can maintain control. So I can't imagine. I mean, one for Hamas, there's always the option that what they do well is just start launching rockets. But I can't believe, given the fact the estrangement between Netanyahu and Abbas and the deteriorating situation in Gaza, can't imagine how that peace process can be revived.
Thane Rosenbaum, Distinguished Fellow at NYU Law School, thank you for weighing in and sharing these insights.
Thank you for hosting me. Of course.
A possible turning point in the heated standoff between the U.S. and Turkey. They have agreed to normalize ties after a possible confrontation over Turkey's offensive against U.S.-backed forces in Syria.
Meanwhile, Turkey continues to crack down on journalists who covered the 2016 failed coup. 6 journalists were just sentenced to life in prison. U.S. and Turkish leaders say they have put aside their differences over Turkey's offensive against American-backed forces in Syria.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson wrapped up a week-long Middle East tour announcing improved relations and saying there is, quote, no daylight between the two NATO allies. Correspondent Emily Rose has more.
After a 3-hour meeting between U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Turkish President Erdogan on Thursday, it looked as though the NATO allies might come to a dead end. But both parties emerged on Friday with a seemingly renewed sense of confidence.
Our relations are at a critical stage. We will either mend our relations or they will get worse.
U.S. alliance with Kurds in Syria in the onslaught on the Islamic State has angered Ankara, which considers Kurds terrorists. Turkey, in turn, launched a bloody military offensive on Kurds in Syria's northwest Afrin region. Erdogan has threatened to extend the campaign eastward to the Syrian town of Manbij, where U.S. troops are based, what could spark a direct conflict between the allies. Meanwhile, the streets rumbled with protest against the U.S., but the allies may yet reach a deal. A Turkish official told Reuters the Turks will put forward a plan to deploy both Turkish and U.S. forces in Manbij, on condition the YPG fighters withdraw to positions east of the Euphrates River.
We will start with Manbij. After YPG leaves here, we can collaborate with the U.S. based on trust. But first, YPG needs to leave immediately.
The plan could be a breakthrough in Turkish-U.S. relations, but Tillerson also called for restraint from its NATO allies.
As to Afrin, we call upon Turkey to show restraint in its operation to minimize the casualties to civilians and avoid actions that would escalate tensions in that area.
This could be a turning point on a path to a renewed and stronger friendship, but time will tell if it can last. Emily Rose, I-24 News.
For more, let's bring in senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson. Nina, a lot of diplomacy there between Tillerson and his Turkish counterpart, and that is in contrast to the rhetoric that we heard before his trip to the Middle East. How seriously should we take this breakthrough? Is it a breakthrough?
I think we should take it very seriously, Tal. There was a joint statement issued by the State Department just hours after that 3-hour meeting that Tillerson had behind closed doors with President Erdogan, and it was a very, very strongly worded statement. Make no mistake, the US and Turkey are shoulder to shoulder again. They're pledging to cooperate mainly on Syria, but they have a lot of other common interests, of course. The US emphasizing the fight against ISIS more than anything. But the key thing is the formal structure now. They're going to meet again in March, and there will be this continuing dialogue to try and repair those relations which were so strained this year. I mean, don't forget, in October, the two sides suspended visa services. and that was very, very serious. It was almost a complete break in diplomatic relations, but they seem to be back on track now after this meeting.
The Turks have been infuriated that the alleged mastermind of the coup 18 months ago was in the United States. The idea of his extradition, did that come up in these talks?
Well, not publicly, David, but you can imagine what was going on behind the scenes. And again, I'll draw your attention to that joint statement that came out. It might sound terribly dry and boring, but there was a very key part of it that said that the US condemned the coup and that they would investigate the Gulen operation, and they would work very closely with Turkey. So I think you might see a development there quite soon.
Nina, to a different story, several journalists in Turkey were sentenced to life in prison this week. Did Tillerson tackle this human rights issue?
Again, not publicly, presumably behind closed doors, but the US did not make a point of this in any public statements whatsoever. It seems that they're going to allow this to be a domestic issue for Turkey. And when the Turkish foreign minister was pressed by journalists in that press conference you just saw, he also said that the state of emergency has nothing to do with these detainments, and it was a separate issue. But of course, the head of Amnesty International is also being detained.
Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent, with us in studio. Nina, thank you very much. Sounds like everything is on the mend, at least until Turkish troops and U.S. troops perhaps cross paths in Afrin in Syria, and then
or
maybe
until
things
the Syrian army helps the Kurds in Afrin, that according to Arab reports today. Well,
back here in the United States, the FBI announced it failed to investigate another tip that could have stopped the gunman in the deadly school shooting in Florida.
Plus, we'll hear the chilling 911 call made by a grandmother in Washington state who reported her grandson to police for planning the same kind of attack on his high school.
Crossroads and I-24 News continues after this short break.
You're watching Crossroads. More troubling reports about the FBI in the wake of the deadly school shooting in Florida. The agency says it received a tip last month that the suspect had, quote, a desire to kill as well as access to guns, but agents failed to investigate.
Florida Governor Rick Scott has called for FBI Director Christopher Wray to resign. And Attorney General Jeff Sessions has ordered a review of the procedures at the FBI and the Justice Department. The sheriff of Broward County, Florida, also said his office received about 20 calls regarding the school gunman over the past few years. The sheriff said he's ordering an investigation into those calls to see how they were handled or mishandled.
Meanwhile, we're learning more about the gunman. Police say 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz confessed to the killings. He also reported he told law enforcement officials that he heard voices in his head that he was being instructed by demons. State lawmakers are expressing outrage over the FBI failures.
How can we live in the most powerful country with the most powerful military, the best economy, the best people, right? We're the greatest. Make America great again. How can we do all that, but we can't keep kids safe in school? They can't learn geography, they can't learn history, they can't learn English and be safe. I mean, we're failing them collectively.
The community of Parkland, Florida came together on this day to lay to rest the first two victims of Wednesday's school shooting, both teenagers.
17 people were killed and dozens injured in that shooting. Correspondent Maggie Rulli has the latest.
What if that was your child that was shot 3 times in the heart, in the head, in the hand? Think about it.
As the first funerals begin today for the 17 victims of Wednesday's mass shooting in Parkland, Florida.
My home away from home was attacked brutally and tragically.
Now the FBI is admitting it made a huge mistake in how it handled a second tip it received last month about the suspected gunman. In a statement, the FBI says a person close to Nicholas Cruz contacted the FBI's tip line with specific concerns about his gun ownership, erratic behavior, and his desire to kill people.
The FBI has determined that protocol was not followed. The information was not provided to the Miami field office, and no further investigation was conducted at that time.
The FBI had already been alerted in September by a video blogger concerned that a user named Nicholas Cruz had left a threatening comment. Attorney General Jeff Sessions today ordered an immediate review and said we must do better. And Florida Senator Marco Rubio said in a statement it was inexcusable that the FBI failed to follow protocols. The community here now turning their pain into action.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence. It happened in Parkland.
That was Maggie Ruley reporting. We were also hearing for the first time the chilling 911 calls made by a grandmother in Florida who called police in a separate case to warn them about her own grandson.
The incident happened one day prior to the attack in Florida. Catherine O'Connor called police after reading her grandson's journal and uncovering a disturbing plot to kill his classmates. The grandmother says she contacted 911 to make sure that someone responded to her report before it was too late.
911, what is the location of your emergency?
I have a call into at the major crimes unit, but I really wanted to talk to somebody, and I had to leave a voicemail. What I'm reporting is I'm finding journal entries from my grandson, and he's planning to have a mass shooting at one of the high schools, and I wanted to talk to somebody about that.
Okay.
To discuss all of this, let's bring in Tim Burrows, a former police officer in Toronto, Canada, and Dr. Jacqueline Schildkraut, a national expert on mass shootings and an assistant professor at the State University of New York at Oswego. First of all, Tim, to you, do you have any idea how many types of these calls that 911 dispatchers receive from family members or friends who are worried about somebody on a given basis?
The actual number, no, but we do know that those numbers are increasing day by day, month by month, year by year, because people are truly listening to the if you see something, say something ideal that really has been designed to help protect us.
I guess my question is it an overwhelming number? I mean, do police have the resources around the United States, even in Canada, to pursue when somebody makes the kind of warning that we just heard?
I don't think the numbers are there. I honestly believe that we are so short-staffed when it comes to law enforcement and the intelligence community that these calls, when they are coming in, they just aren't being acted on because it has to be graded on a importance or a seriousness level. There are so many of the minor ones that those ones will take away from the real ones that we do need to get our attention to and that we do need to intelligently investigate.
Dr. Jacqueline Schildkraut, I guess same question to you. You have conducted the research in this field. To what extent is it common, such chilling conversations as the one that we just heard?
You know, we see in the research, a number of researchers have conducted research on averted rampages, and there's a distinct pathway to violence that these perpetrators follow, and there's ample time to disrupt them before they get to that final act. Again, I don't know the numbers as well, but, certainly, students calling in, making, giving that information to authorities to be able to investigate, teachers, there's a number of individuals who are able to get that information into the hands of the people who can adequately investigate them and determine the credibility of those threats.
So, Doctor, it sounds like if there are some clear red flags that everybody can agree on, the problem then becomes the communication between the people who may see these red flags and either law enforcement or educators who may be responsible for checking things out.
Absolutely. Threat assessment is one of the most important tools that we have. In 100% of cases that we see, shooters always leave behind some sort of leakage. We can look back to the 2005 shooting in Red Lake, Minnesota. 40 individuals were indicted, a number of them students, for not necessarily co-conspiring on the event, but knowing that it was going to happen before it did and not, acting on it and getting that information into the hands of the people who could do something.
We've been talking a lot over the last few days of how to prevent the next mass shooting, and I want to take it to you, Tim. This was a clear FBI failure. Can you maybe imagine or describe to us from your expertise what might have went wrong there? How can the next incident be prevented, follow a certain protocol?
I think what went wrong in this case was just nothing short of negligence. What they are releasing now and what they are apologizing for shows the fact that there was enough information that it should have been acted on, it should have been forwarded on to the Miami field office, and it should have proceeded further. Like the doctor said, we do have breadcrumbs almost in every single one of these cases. The information is there. It's whether the people are acting on it. There's clear protocols to exactly what needs to be done. And if those situations meet those protocols, it has to be done. There can't be any excuses for that failure.
And if the negligence is there, as you suggest, who's responsible for it, in addition perhaps to the field FBI agents who may have received that tip? Are there other people higher up the chain who should also be held responsible?
If it comes to a matter of fact that the supervisory community in the FBI wasn't doing their job and the checks and balances weren't being followed, then naturally it does fall to the leadership. And whoever the buck stops with, that's who holds the bag, and that's who has to be ultimately held responsible. But again, we can't shirk the responsibilities of those people that are supposed to be vetting that information and acting upon it.
Jacqueline, usually after such mass shooting incidents, we talk a lot about gun laws, but this time it seems like there is the mental health dimension that has been added. You're talking about red flags. How can people, relatives, classmates actually recognize them?
You know, I think what the grandmother did in the audio that you guys played was really important. She recognized not only, you know, that there was these overt threats, but in a lot of cases, the threats aren't necessarily that deliberate. And what we see is that there's a deterioration of behavior over time, whether it's withdrawing, whether it's becoming more aggressive. And it's important, you know, not to necessarily overreact, but to take those things as serious, credible threats. And, you know, if they start to compound on each other and interact with things like gun ownership, you know, then it is important to alert the authorities and get that information into the proper hands. It's always better to err on the side of caution and, you know, let the authorities who are trained in threat assessment go ahead and make that determination. It's not for citizens to determine whether or not somebody's going to be the next mass shooter.
And then, Tim, as far as guns are concerned, we know based on the latest police timeline that all of the shooting happened within just 7 minutes, that the shooter went up 3 different flights of stairs, went into about 7 or 8 different classrooms, and in 7 minutes was able to kill 17 people. Hard to imagine that anybody would be able to carry out that kind of violence if they didn't have an AR-15 or some type of rifle that has the ability to fire that rapidly.
Well, let's not blame the weaponry. A handgun in the hands of somebody that was properly trained could have done the exact same thing. We have to really, truly look at the people that are perpetrating these crimes. 7 minutes is an eternity for the people that were listening to what was going on, even longer for the 911 dispatchers that had to go through it and try to get the people there, knowing that the response was on the way, but it was not going to be fast enough under any circumstances. I think what we have to look at when we look at these breadcrumbs and all the pictures and pieces that are put together through social media nowadays, you have to take a real hard stance at what's going on. When there is enough red flags that are going up, it's not a matter of legislation, it's a matter of common sense. Would we allow this within our communities going forward? I have to say we can't. The time has come.
Tim Burrows, a former police officer in Toronto, Canada, and Dr. Jacqueline Schildkraut, a national expert on mass shootings and an assistant professor at the State University of New York. Thank you both. We appreciate it.
A horrific report out of Afghanistan. The United States says that more than 10,000 civilians have been killed or wounded in that country in the past year alone.
And India is getting closer to Iran in hopes of bypassing its main rival, Pakistan. Just gotten a startling new report on the scale of the devastation and violence and bloodshed in Afghanistan in just over the last year. According to the United Nations, more than 10,000 civilians were killed or wounded in Afghanistan last year in 2017 alone.
I-24 News correspondent Marcus White has the details.
5 suicide bombers detonate a car packed with explosives at a gate of a police station. The blast in eastern Afghanistan killed 6 people and injured dozens in June 2017. In July, a suicide bomber killed 40 people in Kabul. Another 8 died in this blast in Kabul in March. Attacks just like these are to blame for the thousands of deaths and injuries to Afghans. The UN says more than 3,400 civilians were killed in Afghanistan last year. More than 7,000 were wounded. The statistics are grim, but casualties are down 9% from 2016. Airstrikes by U.S. government forces are also to blame for some of the deaths and injuries, according to the report.
We will defeat them, and we will defeat them handily.
In August, President Trump announced plans for a more aggressive U.S. strategy in Afghanistan.
I will not say when we are going to attack, but attack we will.
Trump didn't announce changes to troop levels, fearing that it would compromise America's military plan. His new policies included an increase in airstrikes. But since then,
Afghanistan is reeling from yet another attack. A car bomb exploded on Wednesday in the eastern city of Jalalabad.
Militants have stepped up attacks. New attacks in Kabul over the last month have killed 150 people. Women and children were hit hard by the violence. The UN says 861 were killed last year and more than 2,300 were injured. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, said most of the attacks rise to the level of war crimes, adding Afghan civilians have been killed going about their daily lives, traveling on a bus, praying in a mosque, simply walking past a building that was targeted. Marcus White, I-24 News.
So many elements involved there. Also Pakistani, the Taliban on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's striking. I mean, the violence is so much worse than I think even we had expected. And it's interesting that this report comes right after, around the same time that the Taliban has sent an open letter to Washington saying that they want to engage in direct talks with the United States. You almost wonder if the Taliban feels like it's suffering as well, as horrible as they are with the bloodshed that they're inflicting, but they're trying to change something.
Could you imagine Rex Tillerson going to speak with the Taliban? No. Well, staying in the region, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani is in India.
The hospitality is part of an effort by India to move closer to Iran in hopes of freezing out India's main nuclear-armed rival, Pakistan. International Affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini has the latest.
As the U.S. ramps up its rhetoric against Iran, another giant, India, is welcoming the Iranian president. Hassan Rouhani is on a 3-day visit to India, meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Saturday. And for both countries, there's a lot at stake.
The two great nations of Iran and India can cooperate with each other in industry, agriculture, and modern technologies on a scale that they can supply their own needs and also the demands of the region.
It's the second official meeting between the two leaders in less than 2 years. Modi toured the Islamic Republic in May 2016, and the result was a trilateral trade treaty with Afghanistan. India is continuously battling its arch-rival Pakistan for influence in Afghanistan, and Iran can help with that. Then there's oil. India is one of Iran's primary consumers of oil. In 2016 and 17, India reportedly imported a record high 500,000 barrels of oil per day from Iran. The two countries are also expected to move forward on multi-billion-dollar energy and infrastructure deals. During a speech at Friday prayers, Rouhani took the opportunity to send a message of unity between Iran and India, aimed at the U.S.
You can see the Western civilization. As you can see in the U.S., there are mass murders in schools, universities, and streets every day. Therefore, the materialistic civilization cannot save us.
Although New Delhi and Tehran generally have positive relations, Modi is known for his ability to deal with various different countries, even if those are at odds, keeping India's interests first. The Prime Minister just visited Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Ramallah, and hosted Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, underscoring an increasingly close relationship with Jerusalem. So far, Modi has been able to eat his cake and have it too, hosting leaders from Iran and Israel while keeping all parties pleased. But with tensions rising in the Middle East, could international pressure force Modi's friends-with-all diplomacy into a corner? Bianca Zanini, I-24 News.
Interesting thoughts.
Well, to Bianca's last point, maybe it's time for India to play a role in the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, and maybe Iran and world powers. Who knows?
Yeah, and given the respect that Modi has certainly in Israel with the Netanyahu government, why not?
Well, Netanyahu said that is nothing new. Just what has changed is that India has close relations with Israel.
Yeah. Still ahead, fashion usually takes, well, it's usually full of glitz and glamour, but one designer is putting a twist on all of it. We'll have that story and a special report by Tal Heinrich when Crossroads continues after this. New York Fashion Week is now over, but while it lasted, it was full of glitz, glam, and some very unique runway shows.
Well, I had the opportunity, David, to attend one of these very different, unique, refreshing shows, I would say, by Israeli fashion designer Leah Berman. Take a look.
No traditional runway, no famous models, no first-row celebrities. Israeli fashion designer Leah Berman instead has chosen her diverse clientele to present the new collection for her brand, Kess.
Women who are a little bit more mature,
who bring their characters, their personality into the clothes, who validate what I do.
Kessa's New York Fashion Week presentation is more than a show. In fact, it's an art display meant to showcase women empowerment and strength. To pull it off, Leah turned to someone who knows a thing or two about art. Her former mentor and instructor, world-famous Israeli artist Miriam Kabessa.
You know, it's actually the first time I'm doing something like that. I never done anything like fashion art thing, and I never painted on the wall.
I see a lot of similar elements with the approach to what you do and how you do, to movement, to casualness, to sheerness.
Stains on any fabric is normally a fashion killer, but over here it's runway material.
Well, I was just putting the pigment on the canvas and letting the models step on it. My job got bigger, telling them when to come out. How do you call that, the director?
Leah grew up thousands of miles from New York City's fashion scene in a kibbutz in Israel. It is there, Leah says, she developed her flair for designing.
I remember the smell of the closet with all the t-shirts that were sewn for kindergarten. I remember the colors. I remember the hand of the woman who was responsible of giving it to us, handing it to us. It really stayed with me.
Leah left that kibbutz and has been in New York City for almost 20 years, and in that time has launched her own clothing line and opened 2 cast stores.
As a designer and as a New Yorker and as a mother, these are my biggest challenges.
Leah, a proud Israeli, says she wants her work, not her nationality, to stand out. Yet she pushes back any criticism that her home country is not at the cutting edge of fashion.
I think that if you see here Israeli women that lives in New York, their sense of style is absolutely magnificent.
Tal, that was interesting and looked like it was fun to be there. Do Israeli fashion designers have much success?
Overseas, I mean, in the U.S. market, some of them, yes. There are some big names like Alon Livne, Inbal Dror, Galia Lahav, that they sell pretty well over here as well, and they dress up, you know, stars like Rihanna, Beyonce, and that's, you know, ever since Gal Gadot with Wonder Woman, I think, made in Israel is the new black.
Wow, interesting. There is another inspirational fashion story to tell you about.
This one from a designer who started out life as a refugee from Sierra Leone and went on to start her own fashion line. Correspondent Erica Jackson has the story.
Of this print. Meet Euphemia and Sydney Davis, Sierra Leone refugee turned London-based fashion designer with her own label, who'll soon represent West Africa as part of the Commonwealth Fashion Exchange, where she'll showcase her designs at a Buckingham Palace reception hosted by the Duchess of Cambridge herself. It's all thanks to an initiative that pairs designers with artisan producers from the Commonwealth's 53 countries to promote sustainable, ethical fashion.
I'm so excited to meet the Duchess of Cambridge. Obviously, we've seen her on TV, and it will be fantastic to be in her presence.
And the refugee who escaped Sierra Leone's civil war at the age of 11 and nearly lost everything says her life now is something she could have never imagined.
I would have never envisioned this when I left Sierra Leone, that I would even be where I am now and working on such a monumental project.
And she's now giving back to her home country, where she's taught 7 men and women how to make clothes in Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown.
Not only am I sort of helping educate some of these people, but in turn supporting their families.
And the designer who's pushing the boundaries has bigger plans that include using her talents to someday make a positive difference through opening a factory in Freetown to create jobs, decent working conditions, and an ethical supply chain.
It's very important that people feel that they can dream and they can achieve. I'm not where I want to be yet, but that's all part of the journey.
With the power of believing, she may just accomplish anything. Erica Jackson, I-24 News.
What a remarkable story, and great to see social responsibility regardless of whether it's artwork or industry or fashion design.
It's amazing when a woman does so.
Absolutely.
Well, we have lots more coming up on Clear Cut with a person who knows a thing or two about fashion. Derek Dennis, you're in for Michelle McCory tonight. Derek, give us the preview.
How do I live up to that? Well, there is much more to get to in the next hour of Clear Cut. Of course, we're tracking the new developments coming out of the Florida school massacre, and we're asking the question, why did the FBI drop the ball on a tip about the shooter's obsession with guns and his desire to kill people? We'll talk to a retired FBI agent. And on a lighter note, what's old is new again. Polaroid is bringing back instant picture taking, but with a modern twist. We'll show you the new Polaroid One Step 2. That's ahead on Clear Cut. Join me. Back to you.
All right. And by the way, on Stateside tonight, to follow up on Derek, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, we're going to talk with Doug Burns, a resident legal analyst, to go through the Mueller indictment on this day. Is it more than something just symbolic? And we'll also talk to some former FBI officials about the FBI dropping the ball on this tip that could have made such a big difference in Florida.
Yeah, this makes the blood boil for some of the families across the U.S. today.
Yeah.
Well, that does it for this hour of Crossroads. Thank you for watching.
Stay with us on 924 News for much more, including Derek Dennis with Clear Cut after this.